Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the sources you share and, well, we try to uncover the most important insights, giving you a shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into a really foundational document. It focuses on one of humanity's oldest yearnings, really. Connection, brotherhood, and, friendship across divides. We're unpacking Fratelli Tutti. It's an encyclical letter from Pope Francis, published back in October 2020. And its central theme is fraternity and social friendship.
Right, and it's important to maybe pause on what an encyclical is. It's a significant teaching document within the Catholic Church, usually addressed pretty broadly bishops, clergy, sometimes like all people of goodwill. But this one, you can tell right from the title, Fratelli Tutti, which means all brothers. It explicitly casts a wider net. It's really framed as a reflection on the human condition, and it's intended for, well, universal resonance. It invites anyone, really, regardless of their faith tradition, to kind of consider its message. It deliberately speaks to that fundamental question of, how do we actually live together on this planet?
Absolutely. So our mission in this deep dive is basically to go through this document, using the structure you've given us, and pull out the most important insights, the core arguments, maybe some surprising points too. We want to help you understand its comprehensive message about building a world based on this idea of, well, brotherhood and social friendship. We're essentially going to summarize what this document talked about, piece by piece.
And the document itself, it grounds its vision pretty quickly in inspiration. Specifically, it cites Saint Francis of Assisi. It points to his life as like an example of universal embrace, this capacity for a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance. He saw everyone as brothers and sisters, not just the people close by, but the leper, the stranger, even famously the wolf. So that sort of sets the moral compass for the whole text. And then it turns to examining both the substantial challenges the document sees in the world today and also the concrete, sometimes quite difficult paths it proposes for navigating towards that different future.
All right, let's really dig into this powerful message about fraternity and social friendship, starting with the document's view of the current state of the world.
Yeah, the encyclical opens by setting a rather, well, sober scene. It paints a picture of the current global landscape, which it identifies as being marked by dark clouds. These clouds, it argues, are actively hindering the growth of universal fraternity. It's essentially the document's diagnosis, you could say, of what's broken in our collective human experience before it starts offering any solutions.
And it really doesn't shy away from listing those problems, does it? One of the first dark clouds it points to is what it calls shattered dreams.
Yes, it observes a rather discouraging trend, a kind of regression in hopes for global or even regional integration. Hopes that, after past conflicts like World War II seemed genuinely promising. It mentions aspirations like a united Europe, which seemed capable of acknowledging its shared roots while still celebrating diversity, and similar desires, perhaps, for integration in Latin America. The document notes that while significant steps had been taken towards these goals, history is currently showing signs of, moving backward rather than forward on these fronts.
So it's not just saying integration is hard, but that we're actually seeing a retreat from progress that was already made. That's quite a statement.
Exactly. The reemergence of nationalisms is explicitly mentioned as a key symptom of this. It suggests a return to older divisions, isolated interests, a kind of closing off after periods where a more united approach seemed possible and, frankly, beneficial. It's framed as a step back from important lessons learned.
That idea of stepping backward is, it's a powerful one. And connected to this, the document presents another major critique: globalization without a roadmap.
This is really a central point. The argument is that while globalization has, undeniably brought us physically closer, making us increasingly connected through tech, travel, trade, all of that, it hasn't automatically fostered genuine brotherhood. We're neighbors in proximity, maybe even digitally linked constantly, but it hasn't necessarily made us brothers and sisters in that relational, empathetic sense.
So the means of connection are there, maybe more than ever, but the will, or maybe the way to use them for actual human connection, is lacking.
Precisely. The source explains this critique by pointing out that the global economy, as it's currently configured, often imposes a single cultural model. This drive for standardization might look like unity on the surface, everyone watching the same stuff, wanting the same products, maybe. But the document argues it paradoxically divides individuals and nations. It creates a kind of uniform world where unique identities and local cultures get squeezed out, leading, the document observes, to increased loneliness in the standardized landscape. Because the focus remains firmly on individual, often self-interested concerns rather than, say, collective well-being, it quotes that striking line. Society that is ever more globalized makes us neighbors, but does not make us brothers.
That really cuts to the heart of it.
Yeah.
All the tools for connection are there, yet the fundamental human connection is often absent,
Yeah.
replaced by, uniformity and isolation.
It's a critique of the qualitative aspect of globalization, that its dominant form has prioritized economic efficiency and maybe cultural homogenization over actual human relationship and mutual respect.
And this takes us to another layer of these dark clouds, the loss of historical consciousness and manipulation of words.
Yeah. This is presented as a significant danger. The document details a concern that awareness of history, the capacity for critical thinking, and a deep commitment to justice are all being actively weakened. It's particularly pointed in its observation that fundamental and, noble words like democracy, freedom, justice, unity are being manipulated and distorted. They become empty signifiers, or worse, tools used by powerful interests to justify actions that, ironically, often contradict the very essence of these terms.
So the language of shared values is being co-opted, twisted, almost hollowed out.
Exactly. The document highlights how public debate itself is transformed not into a means for seeking truth or common ground, but into a means of contention and conflict. The goal becomes winning by destroying the opponent, not by persuasion or, seeking understanding. This corrosive environment makes genuine dialogue, which we'll definitely talk about later, incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible sometimes.
You can certainly see that dynamic playing out in, many public spaces today. Feels very familiar.
It's a phenomenon the document identifies as deeply damaging to the social fabric. And closely linked to this is a theme Pope Francis has often emphasized, the throwaway culture. The Encyclical argues this isn't just about discarding material goods, it extends to discarding human beings themselves.
This is a particularly stark and, frankly, moving point in the source material. It gives specific, quite painful examples.
It does. It mentions the demographic issue in some affluent parts of the world where there's, a lack of children leading to aging populations. And then, crucially, it talks about the abandonment of the elderly. The document notes with sadness how they should not have died that way during events like the coronavirus pandemic. But it immediately clarifies that similar cruel discarding, a failure to care for them, happened during heat waves and other circumstances before the pandemic. This, it argues, isn't some anomaly. It reveals a deeper societal mindset where, as the document puts it, only personal interests and immediate convenience truly matter. And this leads to the devaluing and discarding of those perceived as unproductive or burdensome.
So the way society treats its elderly is seen as kind of barometer for this throwaway mentality, revealing something deeper than just material waste.
It's really an indictment of a culture that prioritizes utility over inherent dignity. And this connects directly to the document's assertion that human rights are not universal enough in practice. Despite the grand declarations made, 70 years prior about universal dignity, the document points out many contradictions that persist.
Where are these contradictions most evident, according to the document?
Well, the source observes that a significant portion of humanity lives in immense luxury, while at the same time, countless others see their dignity violated, scorned, or ignored. It makes a direct and strong link, stating this is often a consequence of an exploitative economy based on profit. The argument is that economic systems built purely on maximizing profit, without ethical constraints or a focus on the common good, inherently create conditions where the rights and dignity of many are systematically marginalized or, frankly, trampled upon.
So the economic model itself can be a source of these dark clouds, part of the problem structure.
That's the document's contention, yeah. It then highlights specific vulnerabilities, groups suffering particularly acutely. It mentions women facing isolation, abuse, and violence, who are often disempowered and unable to effectively defend their rights. And it turns a harsh spotlight on the global issue of slavery and human trafficking, calling it a scourge.
The document includes some very specific and, disturbing details here.
It does. It cites how criminal networks are leveraging modern information technology to ensnare young people and children all over the world. It describes the forcing of abortions as an atrocity and the kidnapping of people for the purpose of selling their organs as a heinous practice. These are included, I think, to emphasize the horrific reality and scale of these injustices and to underscore the document's urgent call for a serious response from humanity as a whole.
Those details really drive home the severity of the problems the document is addressing.
Yeah.
It's not out.
No, they illustrate the depth of the darkness it sees hindering fraternity. The Encyclical also dedicates significant attention to conflict and fear. It observes that wars, terrorism, and persecution are rarely judged objectively. Their perceived rightness or wrongness often depends on specific interests, particularly economic ones. The criteria for condemnation or support seem to shift based on who benefits.
This ties back to the manipulation of language and the dominance of self-interest we were just talking about.
Absolutely. It's a consistent thread running through this section. The document makes the sobering observation that such violence is tragically increasing globally and is taking on the features of a gradual Third World War. It suggests that seemingly isolated conflicts in different parts of the world are interconnected, part of a larger, diffuse pattern of global violence and instability. And it argues that fear is deliberately cultivated and used, leading people to seek a false security sustained by a mentality of fear and mistrust.
And fear, of course, is the architect of walls, isn't it?
Precisely. The document describes the temptation to build walls, not just the literal physical barriers between nations or communities, but also metaphorical walls within the heart. It points out a profound paradox here. Those who build these walls, seeking to protect themselves or their interests, ultimately become enslaved by them. They become trapped by preventing the very exchange, encounter, and learning that could enrich them and lead to genuine security built on trust and cooperation, not just isolation.
It's a powerful image that wall builders become prisoners of their own making.
It is. And finally, in this diagnosis of the dark clouds, the document offers a critique of the digital world, which it frames as information without wisdom.
That seems counterintuitive, doesn't it, given how much information is available online?
That's exactly the point. While the document acknowledges the immense potential for connection offered by technology, it also notes that digital movements for spreading hatred and destruction aren't just random occurrences. They often have roots and are actively facilitated and amplified by these platforms. It points out how many online spaces create closed circuits where people primarily interact only with those who already share their views.
These are the echo chambers and filter bubbles we hear so much about.
Exactly. This environment shields people from different perspectives, making genuine dialogue difficult. It facilitates the spread of fake news, disinformation, and significantly increases prejudice and hate. The document makes a particularly challenging observation here, stating that even in Catholic media, limits can be overstepped, defamation and slander can be tolerated.
Wow, that's a direct critique within its own house, so to speak.
It pulls no punches there. It contrasts this online environment with true wisdom, which, it argues, requires encounter with reality, real-world interaction and experience, and crucially, requires genuine listening. The document observes that the sheer speed and volume of the modern world, especially the digital world, makes us mostly deaf. We're too hurried, too impatient to truly hear others, to absorb their perspectives, or to engage in the patient process needed for wisdom. This lack of listening actively hinders the possibility of dialogue and the search for deeper truth.
So, Chapter 1 of Fratelli Tutti paints a comprehensive and frankly quite bleak picture of a world fractured by self-interest, fear, division, and a failure to connect meaningfully despite all our technological proximity.
It's the necessary starting point, isn't it? A clear-eyed look at the challenges that make universal fraternity seem difficult, maybe even impossible in the current climate. It's the problem statement before it turns to the solution.
Okay, so after laying out that stark diagnosis, the document shifts gears pretty dramatically. Let's transition to Chapter 3, which is titled Towards an Open World. This sounds like where it begins to offer a vision for moving beyond those dark clouds.
Precisely. This chapter moves from identifying the problems to articulating the document's positive vision for building a different kind of world, one characterized by openness, welcome, and genuine connection. The fundamental idea here is the imperative to move out of oneself.
Moving out of ourselves. How does the document explain that? It sounds a bit abstract.
Well, it suggests that human beings are inherently created for a fullness that can only be found in love. This isn't just sentimentality, it's described as involving a kind of fundamental law of ecstasy. Etymologically, ecstasy means standing outside oneself. The document applies this to human nature, suggesting we are wired, in a sense, to move outside of our own limited concerns, our own ego, to find others, to connect, and to love. It contrasts this inherent drive with closed groups or self-referential couples or isolated individuals, which it sees as forms of idealized egoism, mere self-protection or comfort that ultimately stifles our human potential.
So it's presenting openness to others not just as a nice idea, but as something fundamental to fulfilling our human human nature, like we needed to be fully human.
That's the argument, yes. It's an anthropological claim as much as an ethical one. And the document uses compelling examples to illustrate this openness in action throughout history and in human experience.
Like the idea of hospitality as a sacred duty.
Yes, it mentions historical examples that embody this spirit, drawing from traditions like ancient desert communities and medieval monks who practiced what was considered sacred hospitality towards pilgrims and strangers. They treated them with all possible respect and solicitude. The document frames this encounter with outsiders not as a burden or a threat, but as a challenge and gift, a chance to grow and be enriched by the encounter.
So welcoming the stranger isn't just a duty you perform, it's something that can genuinely enrich the welcomer as well.
That's the perspective presented. This flows into the concept of universal love, the kind of love that centers attention on the other person as one with himself, seeing the other's well-being as intrinsically linked to one's own. The document states that this universal love, which embraces everyone, is possible, particularly with the help of grace for believers, and it encourages actively working to overcome all prejudice, all historical and cultural barriers, all narrow self-interest.
And this is where the document really highlights a key story to embody this idea of universal love and openness, the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Absolutely. The parable from Luke's Gospel, chapter 10, is used extensively throughout this chapter as the central illustration of what it means to live with an open heart towards the whole world. The document recounts the basic story as you find it in the text. A man is traveling, falls among robbers, is stripped, beaten, and left for dead on the roadside. A priest and a Levite, figures of religious standing, pass by on the other side. But a Samaritan, someone from a group typically despised by the injured man's people, stops, cares for him, bandages his wounds, takes him to an inn, pays for his care, and even promises to return and cover any further expenses. It's a radical act of compassion across social divides.
And the document draws deep meaning from the question that actually prompts the parable in the first place. And who is my neighbor?
Yes. This is perhaps the most crucial takeaway from the document's use of this parable. It highlights how Jesus' response deliberately shifts the focus away from the lawyer's initial question. The lawyer wanted to know who qualified as his neighbor, essentially asking, who do I have to love? Who's on my list? Define the boundaries for me. But Jesus' story, and the question he asks after telling it, which of these three do you think proved neighbor to the man, forces a different perspective. It shifts from who is my neighbor to whose aid I ought to come. It changes the focus from defining who the other person is to defining who I am called to be for others, regardless of their identity, status, or relationship to me.
Wow. Okay. It completely flips the perspective from judging who deserves my help to actively choosing to be helpful, to act as a neighbor, regardless of who the other person is.
Exactly. It moves from a static definition, who is my neighbor, to a dynamic call to action, how can I be a neighbor? And the document makes it crystal clear that indifference to suffering, just living aloof from pain, is simply unacceptable in this framework. It uses strong, challenging language, quoting the idea that we must never let anyone continue to live on the fringes of society. It states that seeing suffering should outrage us, that it should shake us from our complacency.
So it's not enough to just intellectually recognize suffering. It has to evoke a visceral reaction, something that moves us to actually do something.
It's a call to allow the pain of others to penetrate our own lives and disrupt our comfort. The document argues that this story of the Samaritan is not just some ancient tale, it repeats itself in our world today.
How does it see that repetition happening? Where are the modern roadsides?
It argues that social and political indifference are the forces that create the isolated roadsides of our modern era. These roadsides are full of victims of conflict, poverty, deprivation, marginalization, exploitation. It offers a sharp critique here, saying that global society often elegantly looks away from this suffering. It might broadcast images of it on TV using seemingly sympathetic or tolerant language, but without actually touching it.
Yeah.
Without getting involved in a meaningful, personal, or systemic way.
Seeing suffering broadcast without feeling compelled to respond? Yeah, that's a powerful critique of our media landscape and maybe our own detachment.
It's an image of detached observation replacing compassionate action. The document then brings the challenge directly to you, the listener, with the call to be the Good Samaritan today.
What does that mean in practical terms, then, according to the document? How do we do that now?
It frames this as a new opportunity in the face of current global problems. It means choosing to shoulder the pain of other people's failures, acknowledging and taking responsibility for the systemic failures and collective indifference that creates suffering, rather than responding with hatred, blame, or resentment towards the victims or perpetrators. It calls for cultivating a sincere, pure, and simple desire to be a people, a unified human community committed to involving, integrating, and actively raising up those who have fallen or been excluded. It emphasizes starting this action from below, case by case, addressing individual needs and local injustices, while simultaneously connecting globally in awareness and solidarity. It quotes directly that the Samaritans of today take charge of the pain of those who suffer.
So it's a call for personal transformation leading to collective action, but starting at the most immediate level of encounter, person to person.
Yes, it's a blending of individual compassion with a commitment to building a just society from the ground up. And the document's interpretation of the parable emphasizes that the Samaritan's actions embody a love without borders.
How does it articulate this borderless love?
It quotes the idea that this kind of love breaks down the bridges that keep us separate and build bridges. It allows us to build a great family where all of us can feel at home, regardless of our origin or difference. And it adds, crucially, that this is a love that has nothing to do with efficiency. It's not driven by cost-benefit analysis or measurable outcomes or transactional expectations. It's a fundamental posture of gratuitous welcome and care for the human person, simply because they are human and suffering.
Okay, so this chapter provides the ethical and spiritual foundation for the rest of the document, really using the Good Samaritan as the prime example of moving from a closed, self-interested, maybe fearful mindset to an open, actively loving one that embraces everyone.
Exactly. It provides the why and the core inspiration for the more specific paths to fraternity that are discussed in the subsequent chapters. It's really the heart of the document's positive vision.
Building on that foundation of the open heart, Chapter 4 then delves into more specific and, let's face it, challenging areas where this openness is needed, particularly concerning migration and the complex dynamics of cultural exchange.
That's right. This chapter takes the principle of the open heart, exemplified by the Samaritan, and applies it to one of the most pressing and often contentious issues of our time: how we treat people on the move. It explicitly addresses the challenge when the neighbor you encounter is a migrant or refugee.
It acknowledges the complexity of this issue right away, doesn't it?
Yes, it states that when the neighbor is a migrant, the challenge of living out fraternity is indeed more complex than maybe the straightforward case in the parable of the man on the roadside. The document first presents the ideal scenario, which is actually avoiding unnecessary migration altogether by creating genuine opportunities for people to thrive and find fulfillment in their home countries. It emphasizes the importance of conditions that allow people to live with dignity and to develop integrally where they are.
And it explicitly affirms the right not to emigrate, that is, to remain in one's own land.
That's a crucial point, highlighting the desirability of staying rooted in one's culture and community if conditions allow. However, the document is equally clear that until those opportunities exist at home, there is a fundamental obligation to respect the right of each human being to find a place where they can not only satisfy their basic needs, but also realize themselves fully as persons. This implies a right to seek a better life elsewhere when staying is not viable.
So while the ideal is to stay home with dignity and opportunity, the reality compels a responsibility to welcome those who feel they must leave. How does the document suggest we respond practically to migrants and refugees then?
It provides a very concrete four-part framework for responding to the arrival of migrants, summarized by 4 key verbs: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. It describes this not merely as a humanitarian handout or a top-down assistance program, but as a joint journey, a shared effort between hosts and newcomers aimed at building open cities and countries that genuinely respect and value differences in the name of human fraternity.
And it backs up this framework with a list of concrete measures needed. It gets quite specific.
It does. The source details several most needed responses, presented as practical steps for states and communities. These include things like simplifying processes for granting visas, especially for humanitarian reasons, facilitating sponsoring programs by communities and private groups, establishing humanitarian corridors for vulnerable refugees, providing adequate and dignified housing upon arrival, ensuring personal safety and guaranteed access to essential services like health care and education, as well as access to justice.
Those are very specific and pretty comprehensive actions.
They continue, covering practical aspects like allowing migrants to keep their identity documents, ensuring access to bank accounts, guaranteeing basic needs like food and clothing, and upholding freedom of movement and the right to work. It also specifically mentions protecting minors, facilitating access to education at all levels, encouraging hosting or temporary shelter programs, respecting religious freedom, promoting social integration through things like language learning and cultural orientation, assisting with family reunification, and crucially, preparing local communities to welcome and integrate newcomers to avoid resentment or misunderstanding.
That emphasis on preparing host communities seems vital for successful integration. It's not just about the newcomers.
It's highlighted as essential. The document stresses the importance of applying these integration concepts in ways that actively avoid discriminatory practices and language. It warns that using language that leads to isolation and inferiority, or fosters suspicion, smooths the way for hostility and conflict, and can result in depriving marginalized citizens of their civil and even religious rights. It underscores that integration is a two-way street, requiring effort from newcomers and genuine welcome and support from hosts.
So it's not just about policies, but about the underlying attitude and the language used in public discourse. That really matters.
Exactly. The document also recognizes that addressing the global scale of migration goes beyond the capacity of individual states acting alone. It calls for a form of global governance for migration.
Why is global governance needed for migration? Why can't individual countries just handle it?
Because the movement of people, its causes and consequences, are inherently global issues. The choices made by any single country regarding its borders or migration policies inevitably have ripple effects on the entire international community. Therefore, the document argues, the response can only be the result of collective effort and shared responsibility among nations. It calls for mid- and long-term plans that move beyond merely reacting to emergencies, focusing instead on comprehensive strategies. These strategies should include effective integration in host countries and genuine development support in origin countries. And there's a key caveat here. This development support must be authentic assistance aimed at empowering local populations, not tied to imposing foreign ideologies or economic strategies that might not actually serve the local good.
Okay, this section provides a very detailed, practical, and ethically grounded approach to migration. It balances the right to stay with the obligation of welcome and emphasizes the need for global cooperation.
It takes the abstract principle of fraternity and makes it concrete in a complex modern issue. And it connects this directly to the broader theme of reciprocal exchange and cultural interaction. The document views mutual aid and healthy exchange between countries and cultures as something that ultimately benefits everyone. It describes a country that succeeds in developing its own culture on its own foundations, drawing from its history, its unique character not as a threat, but as creating a treasure for all humanity. It states plainly, we are all saved together or nobody is saved, arguing that poverty, suffering, or the loss of cultural richness anywhere ultimately diminishes the entire planet.
It strongly emphasizes our interconnectedness and mutual responsibility for the well-being and richness of the whole human family. We're not isolated islands.
Yes. And related to this idea of mutual benefit is the concept of gratuitousness. The document explains that much of the most valuable things we receive in life, like truth, dignity, love itself, are given to us free of charge. We never pay for it. This profound experience of having received gratuitously, it argues, should inspire us to act in kind, to give freely to others, without expecting anything specific in return, echoing Christ's instruction, you received without pay, give without pay.
That's a powerful reminder that generosity is a response to grace, or just a life itself, not a transaction for profit.
It grounds the call to generosity in the very nature of human experience. The document also navigates the potential tension between promoting universal fraternity and acknowledging a healthy love of one's own homeland or culture. It quotes the sociologist George Simmel, "Man is a being with limits who is without limits."
How does it balance that, the idea of belonging to a specific place with belonging to the whole world? That can feel like a contradiction sometimes.
It warns against two unhealthy extremes. One is an abstract, disembodied universalism that ignores the importance and richness of local identity and lived experience. The other is an isolated localism, a kind of fearful closure to anything new or different, which it describes as like a folklore museum, preserving tradition but fearing any dynamic exchange. The document argues that true, healthy openness and love for wider humanity actually begins with a genuine, grounded love of one's own land. It compares this to the necessary act of caring for one's own home so it doesn't collapse.
The welfare of the world also demands that each person protect and love his or her native land. That's a direct quote, right?
That's the direct quote from the source, yes. This grounded love of one's own culture and place, it argues, is not opposed to universalism, but is actually the foundation that enables healthy exchange. It provides the unique perspective and rootedness needed to engage meaningfully with others and contribute something distinct to the global human family. It's about having a strong identity from which to connect, not an identity that isolates.
This leads directly to the document's critique against cultural homogenization.
Yes, it explicitly criticizes the idea of a universalism that is homogeneous, uniform, and standardized, dictated by one dominant culture, often economic or Western. This kind of forced uniformity, it argues, is impoverished because it loses the immense richness found in a polyhedron, a multi-sided figure where each face, each culture, contributes a unique beauty and perspective. Instead, it presents the positive vision of identity not being diluted by encounter, but rather being deepened and enriched in dialogue with those who are different.
It's a celebration of cultural diversity as a strength, not a threat to unity.
Precisely. And the document uses the term mestizaje, a Spanish word meaning mixing or synthesis, to positively describe how open cultures interact. They don't just tolerate differences, they synthesize, blend, and create new, enriched forms of beauty and understanding, free from cultural impositions or hierarchies.
And finally, this section brings these ideas together by linking love of Homeland with love for the wider humanity.
Yes, advocating for cultivating an attitude of living without borders in the heart, even though physical borders may exist between nations. These physical borders, it suggests, when viewed through the lens of fraternity, should be porous, allowing for beneficial exchange of people, culture, goods, ideas that originates from a grounded love of the local level that extends outwards to embrace the global community.
So, Chapter 4 provides a detailed roadmap for applying the principle of the open heart to complex issues like migration and cultural identity. It really emphasizes dignity, gratuitousness, respect for both local identity and universal belonging, and the potential for mutual enrichment through encounter.
It demonstrates that the call to fraternity isn't just abstract. It has profound implications for how we organize our societies and interact across differences day to day.
Okay, let's move from the realm of the heart and cultural interaction to the structures of power that shape our world. Chapter 5 is titled, A Better Kind of Politics. This sounds crucial.
Yes, this chapter directly confronts the role and nature of politics in either facilitating or hindering the development of fraternity and social friendship. It argues that the current dominant forms of politics often fall short, and that a better kind of politics is urgently needed, one that genuinely serves the common good and is rooted in, well, love.
It starts by analyzing key political concepts like people and populist.
Yeah.
How does it distinguish those?
The document makes a crucial distinction, warning against confusing the two. It explains that the term people, in its deeper sense, refers to something rich, a common identity built up of social and cultural ties, a shared history, and a slow, often challenging process of working towards a shared project and destiny. A leader who is genuinely popular in this sense understands and interprets the nation's feelings and culture in a positive way, seeking to guide them towards that common project. This is explicitly contrasted with irresponsible populism.
So there's a positive sense of rooted shared identity and leadership, people, and a negative, potentially manipulative version, populist, that maybe just exploits sentiment.
Exactly. The negative sense of populism is seen as potentially superficial, driven by exploiting popular sentiments for personal power or short-term gain, rather than genuinely serving the long-term good of the people as a whole. The document also argues that truly overcoming inequality requires more than just temporary assistance programs, like welfare checks.
What does it say is needed instead, if not just assistance?
It calls for policies that foster robust economic development, which leverages regional potential and, most importantly, creates dignified jobs. While temporary assistance can be necessary in emergencies, the document argues it can't be the primary or permanent solution because it doesn't address the root cause, the lack of opportunity in work.
Which brings us to what the document calls the dignity of work. This seems like a major emphasis.
It's highlighted as not merely one important issue, but the great issue. Work, the document insists, is essential not only for earning a living, but for human dignity itself. It states emphatically, there is no worse poverty than one that deprives people of work and the dignity of work.
So it's about much more than just income, then.
Much more. Work is described as fundamental for personal growth, for building healthy relationships with others, colleagues, community, for self-expression, for sharing one's gifts and talents with the world, for contributing to the common good, and fundamentally for living as a people. The document is clear. Politics has a primary responsibility to ensure that work is available for everyone.
The Encyclical also offers a significant and pretty direct critique of liberalism and trickle-down economics.
It does. It critiques certain expressions of liberal political and economic thought that it sees as ignoring inherent human weakness, focusing too narrowly on individual freedom and market efficiency as the sole drivers of prosperity, and consequently overlooking social issues or the broader common good. While it doesn't use the exact phrase trickle down, the document explicitly describes and critiques the naive idea, which takes for granted that once the free market is ensured, there will be a spillover effect to produce greater justice and inclusiveness in the world.
And what is the document's conclusion about this economic theory? Does it think it works?
It states directly, based on observation of global realities, that this theory has not resolved the inequalities that give rise to new forms of violence. It presents this as evidence of the failure of an approach that prioritizes market mechanisms and individual accumulation above the well-being of society as a whole and the pursuit of genuine justice and inclusion.
So it sounds like a clear rejection of the idea that the market, left to itself, will automatically solve social problems like inequality.
That's a key part of the critique, yes. And it connects this critique directly to the pandemic's lesson. The document argues that the global COVID-19 pandemic starkly exposed the fragility of our interconnected world systems and demonstrated that not everything can be resolved by market freedom. In a crisis requiring collective action, solidarity, and care for the vulnerable, the limitations of purely market-driven solutions became painfully clear. This experience, it suggests, highlights the urgent need for a healthy politics, one that is not subservient to financial interests or market ideology, but is instead centered on human dignity and committed to building alternative social structures that prioritize the common good and human well-being.
So the pandemic underlined the necessity of politics actively shaping society for the good of all, rather than just letting the market dictate outcomes. Politics has a job to do.
Precisely. It calls for politics to reclaim its role as a force for social good. The document also discusses valuing popular movements. These are, spontaneous movements that arise from the bottom up, from communities and grassroots groups, often among the poor and excluded.
Why are these movements seen as important in the document? What role do they play?
The document defends them as being vital expressions of solidarity and important forces for addressing the needs and asserting the dignity of those who are often excluded from mainstream political and economic systems. It advocates for encouraging their coordination and mutual support, but stresses that this must be done without trying to control or absorb them in a way that makes them lose their unique style, their energy, and their connection to the people they represent. They need to stay authentic.
They're seen as essential engines of solidarity and advocates for the marginalized then.
They are recognized as powerful social actors. The document then turns to international power and reform, discussing the role and limitations of global organizations like the United Nations.
What is its perspective on these international bodies? Are they working?
It calls for their reform to make them more effective and representative. It stresses the fundamental importance of upholding international norms and legal agreements, citing the principle pacta sunt servanda agreements must be kept as essential for global order. It strongly advocates for using peaceful means of dispute resolution, negotiation, mediation, arbitration as proposed by the UN Charter, seeing these as the only legitimate path to resolve conflicts between nations.
And it seems to view the UN Charter itself quite highly, despite maybe needing reform in practice.
Yes, it presents the UN Charter, when respected and applied with transparency and sincerity, as a fundamental juridical norm for the international community. The document even goes further, contemplating the possibility of a form of world authority governed by law, emphatically emphasizing by law, not a personal ruler. It suggests that some global problems are so vast and interconnected, climate change, pandemics, migration, that they require more effective, legally constituted global organizations to address them collectively, as individual states are insufficient on their own.
So, a call for stronger, reformed international cooperation, grounded in law to tackle global challenges. Not world government, but world governance based on law.
Exactly. It highlights the serious structural weaknesses in world society, arguing that these require fundamental change, a reorientation of priorities, not just superficial adjustments or patchwork solutions. This means redirecting human energy and political will towards genuinely new paths for building global community.
This sets the stage for the concept of political love, which the document introduces as the necessary engine for this better kind of politics. That sounds ambitious.
It is. The document argues that the challenging work of building fraternity and social friendship, particularly through political means, is not just a pragmatic task, but is itself a lofty form of charity. It draws a crucial distinction between individual charity, which involves helping one person directly, like the Samaritan helping the injured man, and political charity, which seeks the common good for everyone in society as a whole, addressing the systemic issues that create suffering in the first place.
It quotes Pope Pius XI, calling politics the most excellent form of charity. That's a strong statement.
That historical quote is used to elevate the political vocation, when practiced authentically for the common good, to the highest form of charitable action. This political love requires cultivating a deep, social sense that goes beyond mere individualism. It fosters a love for the common good, not as an abstract concept, but as the well-being of everyone in their interconnected social dimension. It's about actively building community and shaping globalization in a way that mitigates its negative effects and harnesses its potential for good.
And this love is described as being effective and transformative, not just a nice feeling.
No, it's not presented as a weak or sentimental feeling. It is described as a force capable of inspiring new ways of approaching the problems of today's world. This means it has the power to profoundly renew structures, social organizations, and juridical systems. However, the document stresses that for this political love to be truly effective and avoid becoming mere empty sentimentality, it must be accompanied by a commitment to truth. Political action must be grounded in reality and truth about human dignity and the common good.
So love in politics needs the anchor of truth to be effective, to not just be wishful thinking.
Absolutely. It uses the powerful analogy of the politician as builder, someone who doesn't just manage existing systems, but has a large, realistic vision for constructing something beautiful and inclusive, creating a kind of beautiful polyhedron where everyone, with their unique differences, has a place and can contribute. It offers a memorable, contrasting quote to clarify political charity. One individual can help another by providing a meal, yet the politician creates a job for that other and thus practices a lofty form of charity.
That quote really encapsulates the distinction, doesn't it, between individual aid and systemic change driven by political action.
It highlights the unique potential of politics, when guided by this form of love, to address injustices at a fundamental level. The document also notes that this political love requires significant sacrifice and patience, especially prioritizing the needs of the most abandoned and vulnerable.
Sacrifice and patience aren't qualities always associated with the fast pace and short cycles of modern politics, are they?
The document acknowledges this implicitly, but argues they are essential. It involves actively fighting corruption, which diverts resources from the common good, battling inefficiency in public services, and confronting various forms of violence and exploitation, from prostitution and the drug trade to the arms trade and terrorism, using technology intelligently to do so. It's about focusing on generating processes that will lead to lasting positive change and bear fruit over time, prioritizing the long-term vision time over immediate gains or popularity space.
Prioritizing building a foundation for the future over just getting quick wins.
Precisely. It also notes the value of different voices and healthy debate in politics, acknowledging that this can sometimes create tension or conflict, but arguing that suppressing differences in favor of uniformity ultimately leads to cultural suffocation. It calls for politics to actively promote tolerance, coexistence, and fraternity, even amidst robust disagreement.
And there's a perhaps surprising idea introduced: tenderness in politics. What does that mean?
This might indeed seem counterintuitive in the often tough adversarial world of politics, but the document presents tenderness not as weakness, but as a form of love that is close and concrete. It's a posture of care that actively touches the heart, opens the eyes to see suffering, inclines the ears to listen, and moves the hands to act. It calls this path of active, empathetic care the path of the bravest and strongest politicians. It argues that the poor and vulnerable, by their very state, have a right to seize our heart and soul, to evoke our deepest compassion and commitment.
That's a really profound idea, that the most vulnerable have a kind of claim on our political conscience and compassion.
It seeks to humanize politics, rooting it in empathy. The section concludes with a powerful moment of self-reflection suggested for politicians, asking them to consider their legacy not in terms of typical political metrics.
What is that question for self-reflection?
The document suggests that upon reflecting on their time in office or their political work, the most important questions are not how many supporters or votes they gathered or how positive their public image was, but rather, How much love did I put into my work? What did I do to advance my people and their growth? What tangible bonds did I create? What positive forces did I unleash? How much social peace did I sow? What place did I allow for the working poor?
Those are challenging, searching questions for anyone in public life. Moving beyond metrics of power to metrics of genuine impact on people's lives and the social fabric itself.
This chapter provides a deeply ethical and, yes, aspirational vision for politics, calling it to be a primary force for love, dignity, and the common good, rather than merely a struggle for power or the management of economic interests.
Okay, so from the structures of politics, the document then turns to the essential method for navigating differences and building the connections needed for social friendship: dialogue. Chapter 6 is dedicated to dialogue and social friendship.
Right. This chapter explores the nature of true dialogue, arguing it is fundamental for building fraternity, and distinguishes it sharply from the many forms of superficial or destructive interaction that are so common in the modern world.
It starts by contrasting true dialogue with things like online monologues. What's the difference?
Yes, the document observes that what is often presented as dialogue, particularly in spaces like social media, is frequently not genuine communication at all. It describes these interactions as heated exchanges or arguments that function more like parallel monologues, where people are talking at each other or past each other rather than truly engaging. It notes that these often aggressive exchanges are frequently manipulated or facilitated by powerful interests seeking to control narratives or sow division. There's lots of talk, lots of noise, but no real listening or mutual understanding.
So it's the appearance of conversation without the actual substance of connection or understanding. What does the document say is required for true dialogue and respect, then?
It states that genuine dialogue necessitates a fundamental posture of respect for the other person. This means recognizing their inherent dignity and acknowledging that they hold legitimate beliefs and interests, even if they differ significantly from your own. It operates on the principle that everyone involved in a dialogue has something to contribute, a piece of the truth, a valid perspective, an experience that adds value to the collective search for understanding.
This implies a necessary humility, right? And an openness to being challenged or maybe even changed by the encounter.
Absolutely. True dialogue isn't about winning an argument or converting the other person, but about mutual enrichment and getting closer to the truth together. Dialogue is also presented as the necessary method for truth. It's described as a patient and trustworthy dialogue that is required to seek truth together. This seeking isn't quick or easy. It demands perseverance, a willingness to be humble, and even the capacity for silence and suffering the discomfort of not having all the answers or confronting difficult realities. It's a slow process of patiently gathering different experiences and perspectives.
And it explicitly contrasts this with the mere accumulation of information, which we have so much of today.
Yes, this is a key insight from the document. It notes that the overwhelming flood of information we experience today does not mean greater wisdom. Wisdom, it argues, is different from having lots of facts or data points. It comes through this patient process of dialogue, reflection, and synthesizing different perspectives, not just consuming data passively.
It seems to link dialogue directly to acquiring wisdom through encounter with reality.
That's correct. Wisdom, the document states, calls for encounter with reality. This reality isn't just abstract facts, it's the reality of other people, their lives, their suffering, their joys, their perspectives. This is powerfully contrasted with living solely in a virtual world where reality, the document notes, can be created, camouflaged, or altered. True dialogue, by forcing a genuine encounter with another person and their perspective, anchors us in a reality outside of our own heads or our curated online feeds.
And central to this genuine encounter and dialogue is the importance of listening. You mentioned this earlier regarding the deaf world.
Yes, this is presented as absolutely essential, the very foundation. The document makes that poignant observation again. The world is mostly deaf due to its speed, noise, and impatience. We are prone to interrupting, formulating our response before the other person has finished, or only listening for points to attack or refute. It refers back to Saint Francis's example of profound listening to God, to the poor, to the sick, to nature as a model for regaining this lost human capacity. Don't let us lose our ability to listen, it pleads.
So the first step towards any real dialogue is simply being willing and able to truly hear the other person. Without that, nothing else follows.
It's the prerequisite. This genuine listening is what enables the culture of encounter that the document advocates for. This culture involves a sincere willingness to find points of contact with others, to actively build bridges rather than walls, and to plan and work on inclusive projects together. It's seen as going significantly beyond mere tolerance, which might just mean putting up with others or ignoring them. A culture of encounter actively seeks out the other and recognizes the inherent value they bring, even in their difference.
However, the document is also careful to make a strong point that this openness and dialogue do not mean relativism. It says, relativism is not the solution. Why not?
This is a firm stance. The document sees relativism, the idea that all beliefs or values are equally valid, or that truth is purely subjective, as a false form of tolerance that is ultimately harmful. It argues that when there's no shared belief in objective truth or firm moral principles, power takes over. Whoever has the most power can then arbitrarily interpret moral values or impose their will, rendering justice meaningless. It courts the idea that without objective truth, law becomes nothing more than arbitrary imposition by the powerful.
So if everything is relative, then might makes right, essentially. There's no common ground for justice.
That's the danger highlighted. So while dialogue is presented as the essential method for navigating the complexities of a pluralistic society, the document argues that this consensus needs truth.
How does it reconcile the need for dialogue in a diverse society with the rejection of relativism and the assertion that there are truths we can find?
It explains that dialogue in a pluralistic society is the right way to search together and identify what must always be affirmed and respected based on human dignity and the common good. It goes beyond simply reaching a temporary consensus based on convenience or power dynamics. This dialogue must involve reason, well-formed arguments, and consideration of diverse perspectives. But it must also be underpinned by a foundational belief that it's possible to arrive at some essential truths.
So dialogue is the process, but seeking truth, or at least shared understanding of fundamental values, is the goal.
Exactly. And the document posits that if something is consistently good for society, fostering human well-being and dignity across cultures and times, it is likely rooted in an eternal truth that is accessible to human reason. Human nature itself, it argues, contains fundamental, discoverable, basic structures that support genuine human development and survival, leading to universal values that can be discerned through dialogue and reflection. The document states clearly that the dignity of others must be respected not because we decide they have it or presume it, but because a value exists in their very being, inherent to their humanity. For believers, this inherent dignity and human nature are understood as being created by God.
This provides a firm grounding for universal values and human dignity, even amidst deep diversity, preventing it from collapsing into pure subjectivity.
It moves the basis for respect from subjective opinion or cultural preference to an objective reality about the human person. Finally, the document links this process of dialogue directly to achieving social peace and the culture of encounter.
And it argues that true peace is much more than just the absence of conflict, right?
Much more. True social peace, the document states, requires constant hard work and skill. While a fragile, superficial peace might be achieved with less effort, perhaps by suppressing dissent or ignoring certain groups, true, solid, and lasting peace comes only from this culture of encounter that actively mixes, integrates, and synthesizes diverse realities. This is a slower, more challenging path than simply avoiding difference, but it is the one that guarantees a lasting peace because it builds genuine bridges of understanding and includes everyone, not just those deemed acceptable or pure.
So, dialogue. Rooted in a genuine search for truth, a commitment to listening, and a willingness to encounter others, especially those different from us, is presented as the essential method for building authentic social friendship and achieving lasting peace in a diverse world.
It's the practical how-to for navigating differences and building the trust required for a truly fraternal society, moving beyond just superficial coexistence or tolerance.
As we approach the conclusion of the document, Chapter 7 presents the final paths to a renewed encounter. This seems to focus on the challenging but profoundly important concepts of peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation in a world that's clearly marked by historical and present-day wounds.
Yes, this chapter acknowledges the deep pain and division that exist globally and proposes specific ways forward. It recognizes that building fraternity isn't just about future ideals. It requires healing past hurts and preventing future ones.
It starts by discussing the fundamental need for healing wounds, breaking chains.
The document calls for actively pursuing paths of peace that are specifically designed to heal the wounds inflicted by violence, injustice, and conflict. It states with stark clarity, every violent death diminishes us as human beings. Violence begets violence, hate begets more hate, and death begets more death. We must break this chain.
A direct call to interrupt that cycle of retaliation and destruction. It has to stop somewhere.
Yes, it's presented as an ethical imperative to actively intervene in that spiral. It reiterates the point made earlier that peace requires cooperation, not uniformity. Building peace isn't about forcing everyone to be the same or think alike, but about uniting diverse people in a common pursuit benefiting all, a shared commitment to building a society where everyone can flourish in their diversity.
It also makes an important distinction between the architecture and handcraft of peace. What's the difference there?
This is a helpful way to think about the different levels at which peace is built. The architecture refers to the large-scale structures, governments, international institutions, peace treaties, legal frameworks that contribute to creating the conditions for peace. They build the house, so to speak. But the handcraft of peace is the essential work done by society itself, carried out in everyday life, in relationships between people, in community initiatives, in actions taken from the ground up. It's the work of the artisans within the house. The document emphasizes that while the architecture is important, great lasting changes in peace and reconciliation often begin and are sustained at this societal grassroots level. It quotes, "Everyone plays a fundamental role in that one creative project, to write a new page of history, a page full of hope, full of peace, full of reconciliation."
So institutions create the framework, maybe, but it's the everyday actions of people that actually build the peace within that framework.
It's presented as a shared, multi-layered responsibility. The document also stresses that genuine peace requires social inclusion.
How does social inclusion relate to building peace? It seems obvious, but how does the document connect them?
Promoting social friendship and building peace, the document argues, means actively reaching out to and encountering the poorest and most vulnerable sectors of society, working to integrate them fully. It's not enough just to reconcile historical groups who are in conflict. Peace must be built on a foundation of justice and dignity for everyone, especially those on the margins. Peace, it states, is a tireless commitment to recognize, guarantee, and concretely restore the dignity of our brothers and sisters, that they may feel themselves agents in their own destiny.
So peace is intrinsically linked to empowering the marginalized and ensuring their full participation and dignity are restored.
It's peace built on a foundation of justice and restored dignity, not just the absence of fighting. The document then tackles the very difficult and sensitive topics of forgiveness and memory, particularly in the context of past atrocities and injustices.
Forgiveness is often seen as necessary for moving forward, but it's incredibly difficult, isn't it, after suffering deep wrong?
The document fully acknowledges this difficulty. It states that forgiveness is indeed possible when injustice has been suffered, and that, for the individual who forgives, it can be profoundly liberating, allowing them to renounce the destructive power of resentment and anger that can hold them captive. However, and this is crucial, it is absolutely crystal clear that this call to forgiveness does not mean tolerance of crime or impunity. The pursuit of justice and necessary reparation for wrongs committed are still required and essential. Forgiveness doesn't erase the need for justice.
That's a really important distinction. Forgiveness is not the same as letting criminals go unpunished or ignoring the need for justice and accountability.
Exactly. It's about personal healing and breaking the cycle of hatred, not societal license for wrongdoing. And the document makes a vital distinction here. Forgiveness is personal. Memory is societal. Forgiveness is an intimate act chosen by the individual who was wronged. It is not something that can be demanded or imposed upon an entire society that has suffered collective injustice. While society can create a climate that promotes forgiveness, it cannot simply decree a general reconciliation that pretends to close wounds or, worse, tries to cover up injustice by insisting that everyone forget what happened.
So individuals can choose to forgive if they can, but society has a different responsibility regarding history and truth.
Precisely. The document argues strongly for the necessity of memory. It quotes that ethnic cleansing, atrocities, genocide, and other shameful historical facts must always be remembered and recalled time and again without becoming numb. This isn't about dwelling in the past negatively or seeking revenge, but about drawing vital lessons.
Why is this memory so crucial for the future? Why not just move on?
The document explicitly rejects the idea of simply turning the page on painful history or saying, "That's past history, let's move on." It quotes with emphasis, "No, for God's sake. Without memory, we will never move forward, we will never learn." Memory is needed to learn from the past, not to justify evil actions committed by one's own side, but specifically to prevent their repetition. It calls for remembering the victims of war, persecution, terrorism, and slavery, and an ethical imperative to never forget past evils. Precisely so, we do not become complicit in their recurrence through ignorance or denial.
Memory, then, acts as a powerful safeguard against repeating the mistakes and horrors of the past. It's a moral obligation.
It's presented as an ethical duty, not a historical burden to be discarded. The document then takes very strong and clear stances on war and the death penalty.
Its position on war, particularly modern warfare, is notably firm, isn't it?
Extremely. The document states unequivocally that war is the negation of all rights and a dramatic assault on the environment. It calls it a failure of politics and humanity, a shameful surrender to the forces of evil, and essentially a defeat in the face of the forces that would divide us.
And it specifically critiques the nature of modern weaponry.
Yes, it argues that with modern means of warfare, particularly nuclear weapons, it is senseless to maintain that a nuclear war could be a suitable means to restore justice. It states clearly that modern weapons make war utterly indefensible because of the immense risk they pose to civilian populations and the planet itself. The potential destruction is just too vast.
It uses the phrase piecemeal world war to describe the current global situation.
This phrase is used to characterize the present reality, where various seemingly isolated wars and conflicts occurring in different parts of the world are, in fact, deeply interconnected. It highlights how the fate of countries is so closely knit to that of others on the world stage, meaning that conflict anywhere has repercussions everywhere, underlining the need for a universal ethic of peace.
The document is clear that justice and peaceful dispute resolution, using frameworks like the UN Charter, are the only acceptable path, not war.
Yes, it calls for a tireless commitment to avoiding war between nations and peoples, and emphasizes that justice is the only firm basis for lasting peace. And linked to the strong rejection of violence is the document's equally clear position on the death penalty.
It states directly that the death penalty is inadmissible. That's very strong language.
That is the explicit and strong language used. It reaffirms the teaching of St. John Paul II, stating that capital punishment is morally unacceptable and is no longer needed legally in modern societies that have adequate systems of detention to protect the public. The document states the Church has a firm commitment to advocating for its worldwide abolition.
It's an absolute moral and practical rejection of capital punishment based on dignity and the purpose of punishment.
Yes, rooted in a belief in the inherent dignity of every human life, even those who have committed terrible crimes, and the purpose of punishment being ultimately oriented towards correction and rehabilitation, not retribution or elimination. Finally, the chapter and the document conclude by discussing the role of religion and dialogue in building fraternity.
It seems to suggest that true fraternity needs something more than just human reason or goodwill.
It argues that while reason can help us understand concepts like equality, building genuine fraternity, that deep bond of brotherhood and sisterhood requires openness to the Father of all. For believers, this connection to God provides the ultimate basis for seeing all humanity as one family. It states, only with this consciousness of being children who are not orphans can we live in peace with one another. It's a spiritual grounding for universal brotherhood.
So a spiritual dimension is seen as essential for the deepest sense of fraternity, for feeling truly connected as siblings.
Yes. It emphasizes the fundamental importance of religious freedom and cooperation. It calls for cooperation not only among different Christian denominations, seeking greater unity despite historical divisions, but also, crucially, between followers of different religions altogether, respecting their distinct identities while working together for the common good of humanity.
And it very directly addresses the painful issue of how religion can be and has been used to justify violence.
This is a very strong and clear message in the document. It reiterates forcefully that violence, terrorism, and hatred have no basis in fundamental religious beliefs. When religion is used to justify such things, it is, according to the document, a result of distortions of authentic religious teachings or their manipulation for political or ideological ends, often tied to underlying social issues like hunger, poverty, and injustice that can be exploited by extremists.
It quotes, adoring God leads us not to discrimination, hatred, and violence, but to respect for the sacredness of life and loving commitment to the welfare of all.
That's presented as the true fruit of genuine religious faith. It also includes the well-known quote from the first letter of John. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. The document explicitly condemns terrorism, explaining it stems from a combination of distorted religious understanding and other factors, not from religion's true nature.
This brings in the mention of the Abu Dhabi appeal, The document on human fraternity.
Yes, the document highlights the significance of the Document on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together, which Pope Francis signed in 2019 with the Grand Imam Ahmad Al-Tayyeb of Al-Azhar. It quotes this document's clear declaration that religions must never be used to provoke war, hateful attitudes, violence, or extremism. It includes the powerful and unambiguous statement from that joint document. God the Almighty has no need to be defended by anyone and does not want his name to be used to terrorize people.
That's a definitive statement against the use of religion to justify any form of violence or terror.
It stands as a clear example of interreligious dialogue for the sake of human fraternity. The chapter, and thus the encyclical itself, concludes with a heartfelt final appeal. This appeal is made in the name of God, in the name of the poor, the suffering, the victims, in the name of humanity, fraternity, peace, justice, mercy, and goodwill. It is a call to concrete action for all people, urging them to adopt the culture of dialogue as the path, mutual cooperation as the code of conduct, reciprocal understanding as the method and standard.
A powerful concluding call to action based on all the principles explored throughout the document, a kind of summary of the how.
And finally, the document briefly offers diverse, inspired examples beyond just Saint Francis, recognizing that the spirit of fraternity has been embodied by many throughout history and across different traditions. It mentions figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu, Mahatma Gandhi, and the French mystic Charles de Foucault, noting that they all, in their unique ways, strived for universal brotherhood and social friendship. It quotes de Foucault's aspiration to be the universal brother, seeking to identify with the smallest and most marginalized.
So the document ends with both a concrete call to action for everyone and inspiring models of people who actually lived out this challenging ideal of universal fraternity.
It provides the vision, the critique of what's wrong, the proposed path forward, and the examples for living out this central message. It's quite complete in that sense.
Wow. That was a really comprehensive journey through Fratelli Tutti. We've moved from the document's clear-eyed diagnosis of the dark clouds hindering fraternity, the divisions, the fear, the self-interest, the throwaway culture, through its aspirational vision of an open world modeled by the Good Samaritan's embrace. Then onto the concrete paths it proposes for building a better world rooted in dignity, a better kind of politics, driven by love for the common good, authentic dialogue based on truth and listening, and processes of peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation grounded in memory, all ultimately flowing from the conviction of a universal human family.
And what really stands out, I think, is the document's insistence that building this world of fraternity and social friendship isn't presented as some simple or naive utopia. It's acknowledged as a profoundly necessary, yes, but also challenging and ongoing path. It requires conscious decisions, concrete actions at both personal and political levels, and a fundamental, sometimes difficult, shift in our perspective, moving away from indifference and self-interest towards recognizing the inherent dignity and value of every single human being everywhere as our brother or sister.
And remember, this deep dive was based directly on the source material you provided, allowing us to explore the key arguments, the powerful observations, and the challenging examples Pope Francis used to make his comprehensive case for universal fraternity and social friendship in today's world. We've really tried to summarize what the document talked about.
Right. And the document makes that crucial point we touched on, that simply accumulating information online doesn't automatically lead to wisdom. True wisdom comes from patient reflection, from experience, and from dialogue, especially encounter with reality and with others who are different. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener. In your own life, how does actively seeking genuine encounter and truly listening, particularly to those whose perspectives or experiences differ significantly from your own, how does that change your understanding of the world compared to just reading or hearing information about them from a distance?
That's a great question to carry with you. Thank you for sharing the source material that made this deep dive possible. Until next time on The Deep Dive.